The day Britain seized the Ottoman navy, the morning of August 1st, 1914, didn't begin with cannon fire. It began with paperwork. Gray light bled over Newcastle, and the river smelled like coal smoke and wet steel. Most people think the Ottoman Empire lost its future because of war. It didn't lose a war yet. It lost a balance sheet. We tell this story like it's about patriotism and naval pride, like it's about flags, fezzes, and a daring decision in London. But the real killer was the ledger. A nation can survive defeat. It can't survive insolvency. Because that morning, Britain didn't seize a ship. Britain seized an invoice. It was a hostile acquisition. A forced repossession disguised as national security. And when the Ottoman people realized their gold had been swallowed by a foreign vault, they didn't just feel anger, they felt bankruptcy. They felt the cold math of being powerless. That's the inversion. The Middle East wasn't reshaped by a battleship's guns. It was reshaped by a foreclosure on national pride stamped in ink. The ship sat in the water like a city block of steel. Men on the docks stared up at it, tiny as ants. The hull was slate gray, the color of storm clouds and secrets. Rivets glittered in the damp air, each one hammered into place by the same empire that would soon claim it. Ottoman sailors waited nearby, wearing fezzes that looked almost defiant against English skies. They had crossed continents to pick up what they had already paid for. They didn't arrive as conquerors. They arrived as customers. They had trained on systems they didn't fully trust. They learned turbines like accountants learn new tax codes. They memorized procedures, not for glory, but for survival. This ship wasn't luxury. It was insurance. Back in Istanbul, the story was already written in the public imagination. Crowds pictured the ship cutting through the Bosphorus like a blade. They imagined the old humiliations erased by a single steel monument. They imagined sovereignty returning on a tide. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. The Ottoman Empire still had parades and palaces. It still had gold embroidery and marble halls. It still had vast maps on the walls, colored provinces stretching from mountains to deserts. It still had officials who spoke like emperors. On paper it was majestic. In the streets you could smell roasted meat, incense, sweat, and river water. You could hear prayers echoing off stone courtyards. You could see uniforms polished until they looked like mirrors, and yet the empire's grandeur was borrowed. It was a costume rented from creditors. Every ceremony was paid for with tomorrow's money. The illusion was maintained with borrowed cash and borrowed time. The Sultan's empire was a mansion with termites. The chandeliers still sparkled. The beams were already hollow. Because the empire wasn't dying from invasion. It was dying from interest. By 1914, the Ottoman economy wasn't a machine. It was an addiction. The drug was foreign loans. The needle was the bond market. The trap was simple and cruel. Whales had drained the treasury. Reforms had costs. Railways demanded steel. Modern armies demanded rifles. But tax collection was weak, corruption was thick, and trade was controlled by outsiders. So the empire kept doing what addicts do. It borrowed again. Debt became a living thing, a hungry monster that didn't sleep. It chewed through customs revenue. It gnawed at ports, rail lines, and salt taxes. It didn't care about flags. It only wanted payment. The antagonist wasn't a general. It wasn't a battleship. It was the bondholder. It was the creditor consortium. It was the cold committee of men in Europe who didn't need armies because they had contracts. The Ottoman state had already experienced the humiliation of financial occupation. Administrations were created to secure repayment. Revenue streams were siphoned before they ever touched Ottoman hands. The empire's bloodstream was tapped by foreign needles. Think about the scale of that. A country can have an army and still be financially occupied. A country can have a sultan and still be managed like a delinquent account. So when the Ottomans decided they needed dreadnoughts, it wasn't a mere military plan. It was a financial gamble, a leveraged bet made by a sick empire trying to look healthy. They couldn't afford shame again. Not after the Balkan disasters. Not after the feeling of watching weaker rivals dictate terms at sea. The Aegean wasn't just water. It was a mirror. And the Ottomans hated what they saw. So they did what broke people do when they want to look rich. They bought something enormous. The fundraising was pitched like salvation. The campaign moved through markets and villages like a fever. Coins clinked into boxes. Jewelry vanished into velvet bags. Families sacrificed food and comfort so the empire could purchase steel dignity. It wasn't just state spending, it was mass subscription. A national crowdfunding drive before the word existed. Poor farmers gave what they couldn't spare. Merchants competed to donate. Women gave bracelets that were supposed to outlive them. Each donation wasn't just money. It was political consent. It was a personal stake in the empire's future. The dreadnought became a floating promise that the empire would not be pushed around again. And in a way, they were right. A dreadnought was not merely a ship. It was a credit rating. Naval power in 1914 worked like financial leverage. It could threaten trade routes. It could enforce blockades. It could decide who eats and who starves. In an age of global shipping, the seas were the world's central bank. Britain understood this better than anyone. The Royal Navy wasn't a military branch. It was a financial instrument. It protected imports, ensured markets, and kept the empire's arteries open. So when Britain saw 2 massive Ottoman battleships being completed in British yards, it didn't just see steel. It saw risk exposure. In Whitehall, Winston Churchill stared at maps like a gambler staring at odds. He wasn't counting heroism. He was counting hulls. He was counting tonnage. He was counting the margin between British survival and British starvation. Britain imported food. Britain imported raw materials. If German ships broke the blockade, bread prices would climb. Coal would tighten. Panic would spread. A nation can endure fear. It can't endure empty ports. So Churchill did the math. British strength depended on a narrow advantage. Lose a few ships early, and the balance could flip. That's how empires die. Not with a dramatic collapse, but with a sudden shortage of shipping protection. And there, sitting on the list like unpaid bills, were the Ottoman ships, the Sultan Osman and the Reshadieh, fully paid for, nearly complete, built by British hands. The Ottoman Empire was officially neutral, but neutrality is just a word when markets are nervous. German influence was rising in Istanbul. Advisors, rail projects, training missions, quiet deals in quiet rooms. From a British view, the nightmare was obvious. Those ships could leave British yards, arrive in Ottoman waters, and then change sides. And then British-built steel would become enemy leverage. So Britain chose the ugliest option. It chose requisition. It chose seizure. Legally, it would be dressed up as emergency powers. Morally, it would be explained as necessity. Strategically, it would be sold as survival. But on the Ottoman balance sheet, it would be recorded as theft. In Newcastle, the shift didn't happen like an explosion. It happened like a bank freezing a withdrawal. Meetings were delayed, access was restricted. Explanations became fog. Ottoman officers sensed it in the way British managers avoided eye contact. The dockyards were still loud, still busy, still alive, yet the gates felt heavier. The atmosphere felt like a courtroom. The Ottoman crews had been waiting as if they were about to claim a trophy. Suddenly they were treated like strangers, like liabilities. Then the moment came. Soldiers marched into the yard. Bayonets flashed in the damp air. Machine guns appeared like punctuation marks at the end of negotiation. A letter was handed over. Official stationery, polite language. The kind of document that ruins lives without raising its voice. It didn't say, "We stole your ships." It said, "We requisitioned them for national emergency." That's how empires commit piracy and still sleep at night. Ottoman sailors were ordered off the vessels they had trained on. They watched British sailors walk aboard and take stations like new owners touring a purchased house. They watched their flag lowered. They watched another raised. And in that moment, the Ottoman Empire didn't just lose steel. It lost credibility. It lost face. It lost the belief that contracts meant anything. The theft traveled faster than ships ever could. It raced through Istanbul in headlines and rumors. It hit coffee houses like a fist. It hit the markets like a sudden shortage. Because the dreadnought funds weren't government money alone. They were personal savings. They were dowries. They were family security. So this wasn't just a diplomatic insult. It was a mass financial trauma. Every donor felt personally liquidated. The gold was gone. The credit was frozen. The Allies had turned away. That's the rule of three. That's how momentum becomes tragedy. In the Ottoman cabinet, moderation was suddenly weak. Neutrality looked like surrender. Negotiation looked like begging. And into that emotional bankruptcy stepped the men who always thrive in crisis. Hardliners. Opportunists. The ones who understand that anger is a currency. They didn't need to invent anti-British fury. Britain had deposited it directly into the public account. Now Germany appeared not as a friend, but as a lender of last resort. A nation offering a replacement asset when the market had just crashed. German warships in the Mediterranean became more than ships. They became a bailout. They became the psychological refund the Ottomans craved. When those German ships slipped toward Ottoman waters, it wasn't simply naval movement. It was a negotiation in motion. It was a deal being offered at gunpoint and desperation. Here's the brutal reality of economics. When your pride is repossessed, you become easy to finance. Not because you're strong, because you're vulnerable. The Ottomans faced a choice that didn't look like money, but was money. Shelter the German ships and risk war. Reject them and look helpless. Either way, the empire's solvency was on the line, and then came the bold fiction. The claim that the Ottomans had bought the German ships as replacements. A transaction announced like a press release. A financial narrative designed to heal a wounded public. Did money change hands? The story didn't need to be true. It needed to be believed. Because belief is a currency too. Suddenly the public mood flipped. Mourning turned into celebration. The stolen dream was replaced by a new steel symbol. The Ottoman state regained face, at least on the surface. But the ledger didn't change. The empire was still drowning. It had simply taken a new loan in a more dangerous form, because those ships came with invisible strings. German crews, German command, German intent. You can rename a ship. You can't rename control. For a short time, Istanbul lived inside a fragile illusion. The government tried to maintain neutrality. It tried to say, we have our ships now. We can stay out. But war doesn't respect balance sheets once the creditors smell blood. Then a smoking gun moment arrived, not in a battlefield, but in planning rooms. It wasn't a treaty carved in stone. It was a decision framed like a foreclosure. It was the moment when the Ottoman leadership realized neutrality was no longer theirs to sell. The empire's sovereignty had already been pawned. It only remained to decide who would collect. In the back rooms, the language would have been polite, diplomatic, formal, but the meaning would have been blunt. You want protection. Pay with allegiance. You want ships. Pay with your future. You want solvency. Pay with sovereignty. That is what foreclosure sounds like when it wears a uniform. And then came the climax, the default. Not default as a legal term, default as a lived experience. The moment when the empire could no longer fund its own choices. Money didn't run out overnight. It seeped away like blood from a hidden wound. Bread became harder to find. Prices climbed. Supplies tightened. The public didn't read treasury reports. They read their empty cupboards. They didn't measure inflation in charts. They measured it in thinner soup. Hunger is the most honest economist. Cold nights in poor districts became quieter. Work dried up. Families rationed. Pride turned to bitterness. You cannot eat patriotism. Meanwhile, the state's options narrowed. War demanded resources. War demanded cash. War demanded fuel, uniforms, rail shipments, and imported materials. And when you can't pay, you don't get to decide. That's the phrase you need to remember. Sovereignty is solvency. When the Ottoman Empire moved closer to war, it wasn't just ideological. It wasn't just strategic. It was financial gravity pulling a bankrupt state into the orbit of a stronger sponsor. Once committed, the spiral accelerated. The Dardanelles became more than geography. It became an economic choke point, a switch that could cut supply lines and reshape bargaining power. And every desperate measure the state took to survive created new debts, new dependencies, and new future humiliations. War magnifies bad accounting. It turns small deficits into fatal hemorrhages. By the time shells began falling and armies began marching, the decisive battle had already happened in the treasury. The empire entered the conflict already weakened, already mortgaged, already compromised. From there, the social consequences followed like night follows dusk. Families lost sons, but also wages. Cities faced shortages. Farmers faced requisitions. Merchants faced collapsing demand. The old imperial promise that the state would protect its people cracked under strain. Humiliation isn't only military. It's standing in line for bread. It's watching foreign officers dictate terms. It's realizing your nation is being managed like a distressed asset. And after the fighting, the aftermath would stretch for decades. Because debt doesn't die when empires die. Debt survives the funeral. New governments inherit old obligations. Successor states inherit broken infrastructure and drained populations. The bills remain even when the flags change. The borders that emerged in the Middle East were not only the product of maps and diplomats, they were the product of resource allocation, of rail lines, of ports, of who held the receipts. Mandates were sold as guidance. They functioned like corporate receivership, administration by outsiders to secure strategic value. Think about the scale of that. Entire regions reorganized like balance sheet segments, oil prospects, trade routes, canal access, tax bases, all cut into units. In that world, ideals were decoration, resources were reality. The Ottoman mistake wasn't simply trusting Britain. It was believing that a contract could protect a weak balance sheet. It was believing that payment guaranteed ownership when power was asymmetric. That's not how markets work. That's not how empires work. The stronger party changes terms when fear spikes. Britain seized ships because Britain feared insolvency under blockade. The Ottomans drifted toward Germany because they feared humiliation and helplessness. Both sides were driven by economic survival instincts. One decision in London echoed across generations because it struck at the one thing a declining empire cannot afford to lose: trust. Once trust collapses, every alliance becomes a gamble. Every treaty becomes a trap. Every promise sounds like a scam. And when trust collapses, the loudest voices win. The ones offering revenge. The ones offering certainty. The ones offering a new creditor. So the day Britain seized the Ottoman navy, it wasn't just a betrayal. It was a market shock. It was a signal to the world that Ottoman property rights were negotiable, that Ottoman dignity had no enforcement, that Ottoman solvency was irrelevant. And once a state is perceived as insolvent, predators circle. That's why this story matters now. It's not a niche naval drama. It's a case study in how economic humiliation becomes geopolitical combustion. You can draw a straight line from that dockyard to decades of resentment, to narratives of Western hypocrisy, to the feeling, repeated across generations, that law is a luxury only the powerful can afford. Britain thought it was taking 2 ships. It was taking something more volatile. It was taking the Ottoman public's belief in fairness. And belief, once stolen, doesn't get refunded. So the next time someone tells you history is made by speeches and battles, remember this shipyard. Remember the donors who paid with bracelets and bread money. Remember the letter on official stationery that turned payment into nothing. Empires don't always fall to bullets. Sometimes they fall to balance sheets. If you want more stories like this, where the real villain is the ledger and the real weapon is debt, subscribe to the channel. Because the people who understand the money understand the future, and everyone else just watches the headlines.